Well, it all began, I suppose, you could say, back in the 1960s at Oxford while I was doing my first degree, which was in biochemistry. And I had the opportunity to do a diving course with the Army, with the Royal Engineers, in fact, down in Southampton, south of England. And while I was there, one thing I learnt was that we only did shallow water diving, so I didn't actually experience this. But I was taught that if you go very deep, and the deeper you go, the higher the pressure of the gas you must breathe, because it has to be the same as the surrounding pressure. If you breathe air at high pressure, you can get drunk, basically. It can make you drunk. It's called raptures of the deep. So I thought, gosh, afterwards I'd really like to do some research on that. And so I looked around for somewhere to go, and blow me down, there was a place at Oxford, although in a different department. It was in pharmacology. And the head of pharmacology there, that was one of his areas of expertise, his main area actually, anaesthetics. So I asked if I could do a PhD with him, and he said yes. So I did a PhD there with him on the effects of anaesthetics at sub-anaesthetic doses, as it happens, low doses, and also diving gases at low doses. And then when I had finished that, he actually offered me another job, still in the same department, to work on cannabis. So that's how I got into research on cannabis. And the reason behind that was that he thought maybe, just maybe, some of the constituents of cannabis, because they dissolve in fats and lipids very strongly, but they don't dissolve in water. Maybe, just maybe, they were interacting with membranes in the same way as low doses of anaesthetics do to produce similar effects. So maybe their mode of action was like an anaesthetic. Maybe they were what he called partial anaesthetics. They could not produce complete anaesthesia, but they could produce the early signs of anaesthesia. So this was a good time to get into the field because it was at a very early stage pharmacologically. Some of the cannabinoids had been isolated from cannabis in the 1940s, but their structures weren't elucidated until the early 1960s, some by Rafi Meshulam and his group in Israel. And they included cannabidiol, of course, and THC. And he not only elucidated their structures, but was also able to synthesize both those compounds, which was great. And so that was a really good time because we didn't know how they worked.
Yeah.
So that led on to my research at Oxford, trying to explore their pharmacology a bit, which is what I went on to do. One of the things I used for that was this bottle of tincture of cannabis. I don't know if you can see that, which was a medicine in the UK at that time, a licensed medicine. It was cannabis dissolved in alcohol, so dark green liquid, and it was used for things like pain relief and so on. It was useful to us because we could get hold of it and we could then extract individual cannabinoids from that, and that was our main source of the cannabinoids we used in my early research. So what I first did was to develop assays, new bioassays for cannabinoids, including mainly THC, because that was the one that we had been discovered was the main psychoactive constituent of cannabis, and that was quite interesting, particularly at that time, because there was a growing number of people using recreational cannabis, so that was an interesting area to get into. We were less interested at that time in the medical uses, but that changed later. And so we went on doing various things, and then eventually the field began to fade a bit, but then it all changed with the discovery that THC acts on what are called receptors. So they're specific proteins with specific binding sites, and when THC targets those, it can produce changes in those proteins in a way that produces its pharmacological effects. And so these receptors were discovered, and in fact in the brain, the CB1 receptor, the first to be discovered, is one of the most highly expressed receptors in the brain, so it's a very important receptor probably because it's there in very high levels. So that raised a question, why on earth do we have, by now, by the way, I'd moved on from Oxford to Aberdeen, and I was doing research in Aberdeen on cannabinoids here, and the question arose, why do we have these receptors? Surely it's not to get high on cannabis, there must be some other reason why we have them. And that led to a search for chemicals in our own bodies which might target these, and that led to the discovery that there are indeed endogenous chemicals in our bodies which can target these receptors. And I was involved in the discovery of the first of those, and indeed the second of those. And the first was anandamide. We called it anandamide because ananda is the Sanskrit word for bliss or internal happiness. And so we called it ananda, and it's an amide, so we called it anandamide. And we published that paper on anandamide back in 1992, having shown, obtained good evidence that it does target cannabinoid receptors. That was a compound, by the way, which was the main player in the field really for that was Rafi Meshulam in Israel, who had extracted it from pig brain. And he sent it to me because we had this good assay, and we were able to confirm that it was acting like THC, and therefore that it most likely was acting on cannabinoid receptors, and that therefore it most likely was an endocannabinoid. And do you want to see the paper that we published that in?
I'd love to, yes.
So I just need to find that. So that's the paper that we published in Science. In 1992. And that really changed the field of cannabinoid research because it made the whole thing much more respectable, and it meant that everyone actually is experiencing cannabis-like effects in their lives. And the next question was, why on earth do we have these endocannabinoids? Well, we'll come back to that, I think, later on in our discussion. So that was the early history, anyway, of my research, although I've gone up to 1990, which isn't that far away.